Fantastic. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are with us today. My name is Jodi. Thank you so much for joining us for this session on diversity, equity, and inclusion and human rights for people of African descent. A time to refocus. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge the land that we are on. I wish to take a moment to respectfully acknowledge the traditional territories of the indigenous peoples whose presence continues to enrich our communities. As some of our colleagues and partners are joining us online, we recognize that this land acknowledgement might not be for the territory that you're currently on. We ask that if this is the case, you take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory you are on and the current treaty holders of those lands. Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. My name is Jodi, and I'm an immigration consultant whose work supports newcomers and marginalized communities. I also focus on my research that is focuses on Black entrepreneurship, pathways to education, immigration, employment, and leadership, along with policies and their impacts on these communities. Today's session focuses on understanding the roots of DEI backlash, re-evaluating current frameworks, and identifying ways to stay the course. We know that we are experiencing intensified pushback on diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts worldwide. It is essential to stay the course and rely on frameworks that help us advance inclusion and anti racism. This also includes the work on allyship. We are pleased to have an esteemed panel who has been doing this work for decades, who can help us unpack this pushback, shifting organizational priorities, different approaches for continuing to advance inclusion and address anti Black racism, and whether a human rights framework is the solution in the wake of attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Today's event is a side event as a part of the broader United Nations fourth session of the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent. The Permanent Forum's mandate is to support the political, economic, and social inclusion of people of African descent and to identify best practices and actions to address challenges and gaps. First, we have Dr. Rhonda McEwen. Dr. McEwen is the president and vice-chancellor of Victoria University in the University of Toronto. She is the senior executive officer responsible for its academic and administrative operation and reports to its governing body, the Board of Regents. Dr. McEwen began her tenure as Victoria University's 14th president in its 186-year history on July 1st, 2022. Prior to this role, she served as University of Toronto Mississauga's vice principal, academic, and dean with oversight of all academic programs, planning and policy, faculty, teaching and learning, and academic experience. She has also served as director of the Institute of Communication, Culture, Information, and Technology at UTM, where she transformed the program into a standalone unit with a new professional experience certificate in digital media, communication, and technology. Dr. McEwen holds an MBA in Information Technology from City University in London, England, an MSc in Telecommunications from the University of Colorado, and a PhD in Information from the University of Toronto. Dr. McEwen was previously U of T's first special advisor on anti-racism and equity. As a researcher, instructor, and consultant of new technologies around information practices, Dr. McEwen focuses particularly on mobile and tablet communication, virtual reality, communicating with robots, and social networks. Next, we have Tamara Thermitus. From 2000 to 2003, Tamara chaired the Advisory Committee on Visible Minorities of the Department of Justice. She also chaired the Committee on Cultural Communities of the Quebec Bar Association and several other communities related to discrimination and equality in the profession and the justice system. From 2004 to 2010, she was president of the Quebec Bar's Committee on Cultural Communities. She was among the first to raise issues of racial discrimination within the profession. She played a key role in developing a course on the social context of law, which is now part of the compulsory curriculum for professional training at the bar. Ms. Thermitus is a national and international speaker. She also regularly publishes articles in various media outlets to inform and raise awareness among Canadians and Quebecers on her research subjects such as racism, intersectionality, reconciliation with Aboriginal peoples, and violence against women. She has also given many keynote speeches on these subjects. In 2011, she became the first Black woman and lawyer for the Ministry of Justice Canada to receive a Prix Mérité from the Quebec Bar. Ms. Thermitus regularly publishes articles in various media on issues such as racism, intersectionality, reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, and violence against women. A laureate of the Queen Elizabeth II Golden Jubilee Medal in 2012, she has earned numerous awards, including the Employment Equity and Diversity Leadership Award. In 2024, she received the Prix Impact Dynasty Award by the Gala Dynasty, focusing on Black communities of Quebec. And finally, we have Dr. Wendy Cukier. Dr. Wendy Cukier is a professor of entrepreneurship and innovation with years of experience in academic administration and served as the vice president of research and innovation at one of Canada's largest universities, Ryerson, now Toronto Metropolitan University. She is the founder and academic director of the Diversity Institute at Toronto Metropolitan University, academic director of the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, and academic research director of the Future Skills Center. She serves on the board of the Federation for African Canadian Economics and has supported a range of research and advocacy projects focused on economic inclusion for the Black community. Her focus is on data, and she provided expert testimony in the Black class action suit. Her work includes policy and regulatory change, as well as working with corporations, large and small, on their equity, diversity, and inclusion strategies. She serves on many expert committees and was a founding member of the International Action Network on Small Arms, as well as projects around the world. In recognition of her contributions, she has been awarded 2 honorary doctorates and the Canada's Meritorious Service Cross. She was also named on University of Toronto's 100 alumni who shaped the century. Her work was recognized by Black Business Professional Association and 2 Harry Jerome Awards, Diversity and Beyond Diversity, the City of Toronto's Bob Marley Award, the Canadian Congress for Diversity, Nation Builder Award, the Education Foundation for Children's Care Canada, 2023 Martin Luther King Award, and many more. She also holds a doctorate from the Schulich School of Business, an MA and MBA from the University of Toronto, and has published extensively. Today's session will be a robust panel, followed by the audience Q&A. So as we go along, please pop your questions in the Q&A box. Without further ado, I will start with the questions for the panel, and I invite us all to this conversation. So thank you all for being here, panelists. We're hoping to have a wonderful conversation around the backlash around DEI and strategies for combating same. So our first question is around, where it's stemming from. So we're seeing backlash against diversity, equity, and inclusion, and anti-racism manifest in different ways globally and in Canada. What are some concrete examples of overt and covert forms of backlash, and where does this backlash stem from? And we'll start with Tamara. Tamara on this.
Hi, good afternoon, Good afternoon, everyone. So to answer to that question, I think that we have to go back a bit in history because, that affirmative action in the United States has always been under attack to a certain extent. And when we look at history, we look at when Obama became president, there was also some attack to him, and we can remember the Bertism that was fueled by the team of the current president. And after that, Obama is also responsible to a certain extent to the creation of the Tea Party. In 2023, we can see that the Supreme Court of the United States of America have end the program with respect to race-conscious admission at college and university, and this has a ripple effect on affirmative action program. We also saw the rise of wokeism, which was like a new definition to attack the fact that the Black people wanted to have like their voice heard, and they were looking for like their human right recognized. The rise of the fact that we had a Black vice president also had an impact. Black South Indian Black vice president are also an impact. We can see that there was a momentum after George Floyd death or murder, and that to implement diversity and a more human right approach to a workplace, but that was met also by a backlash. We have to understand also that this backlash coming mainly from the United States, and there's a change of democracy that's coming in 2015 in a sense, 2050 in a sense that at that point of time, the majority of Americans won't be of a white descent. They will be like more like colored or visible minority. And we also have like the impact of like social media and fake news. I guess that Dr. Rhonda McEwen will speak about that a bit. But we have also to acknowledge that after the death of George Floyd, there was like a kind of a people embrace diversity and inclusion. And there was a kind of efficiency that we can see, but also that efficiency make an attack to DEI because it changed the power structure. And when we're changing a power structure in society, usually there's some backlash. So in a nutshell, I would say that this is part of like an environment. And when we're talking about social change, it's also backlash is near the door, like, it's something that it's part of the environment. So when we're social change and power structure, social change of power structure bring to the attack of DEI. And I have to say also, and I would give the baton to Professor Dean McEwen, President McEwen, but I think also about Claudine Gay, the attack also that she suffered as a president of a university. Those attacks were like framed as an attack on freedom of expression, but there was much more underneath it. So President McEwen, I gave you the baton.
Thank you so much. And you can call me any of those. Those things are good. I've been all those things. I think it's a great time to talk about what's happened in academia. I think it's important to look at academia because it has been one of the places where the society and communities around the world have deemed to be safer spaces for these kinds of conversations. So to see what's been happening with DEI especially in the United States and in Canada, increasingly it's very informative. So just to step back a second, many of you would have followed in December of 2023, where the House Committee on Education and the Workforce started calling in the US, calling forward presidents to speak on anti-Semitism on campuses. And it sort of began with President Liz McGill, who testified on December 5th of 2023. What happens next, we see, is that she resigns her position on December 9th. So she testifies on the 5th, resigns by the 9th. Harvard University, so Claudine Gay, who testified also in December of 2023 at the congressional hearing, widespread backlash, similar to what happened at the University of Pennsylvania, happened with her as well for Harvard. Gay resigned from her position on January 2nd, 2024. Equally, we have just now seen later resignation from Columbia University President Manoush Shafiq, who was invited to testify on April 17, 2027, so 2024, sorry. So you can see several months later, the pattern is there already, but we see another one, and her handling on campus tensions related to the Gaza conflict and the Gaza war. And you can see again the result, Shafiq resigning on August 14, 2024. There were several other presidents as well. Here in Canada, similarly, we have had a number of presidents that had to go and speak before a standing committee in the Canadian legislature on the issue of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. Those presidents are, luckily for now, still in their positions. So we have not seen resignations on the Canadian side, but we have seen significant pressure. For those of you who are dialing in from other parts of the world, you may or may not be aware that in Canada, we are just weeks away, a couple of weeks away from a federal election. And what this federal election has done is really we've seen a rise in certain kinds of rhetoric when it comes to DEI. People on the campaign trail talking about wokeness, that universities become places for woke ideology and kind of brainwashing of students, not protecting freedom of expression in Canada. And we have seen pressure by the provinces. So in Canada, higher education is actually funded from provinces, not from the federal government. And so each province has the ability to form or to inform how they fund. And so we have seen changes starting to come in especially in Alberta, where the presidents have been working with their teams, and we've seen some changes coming. So removal of the term DEI and replaced in some cases with other language, ABC, ACB, these are new ones coming out, access, community and belonging, and so on, as replacement terms for DEI, and a re-examination of the DEI work that had preceded those moments. So we are not without effect here in Canada. We are seeing tremendous pressure in the United States, though. Colleagues there are witnessing, the state getting involved in curriculum, what can and cannot be read in the classroom, what cannot be taught. So it goes beyond policy into actual instructional material, which is really almost unheard of in this modern era. And so we are seeing this backlash play out in a very, very particular and strenuous way within the academy.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for that, Dr. Rhonda. We've also seen evidence of some professors even leaving their posts in the United States to move north as a result of that. But we can get into that through other conversations or other parts of the conversation. Dr. Cukier, could you give us a little bit about the business case, the business situation where this backlash is coming from with relation to DEI and anti-racism?
Sure. And thanks very much for including me. I really appreciate being part of such a illustrious panel. So I wanted to say just something in follow-up to Dr. McEwen's comments, which I think is important. People are trying to create the idea that research that considers EDI is somehow not good research. And I want to say really clearly, I was previously a vice president of research and innovation. Research excellence is not possible without an equity, diversity, and inclusion lens. And by that I mean, whether you're doing social science research and trying to understand people's experiences, if you don't have an intersectional perspective on the experiences of different people, you can't possibly understand what it is you're studying. If we look at scientific research, there's so many examples of medical research that has harmed people as a result of not taking an equity, diversity, and inclusion lens. And that's everything from genetic research to tests that were done on treatments. If we think about COVID, if we think about the process of immunization, and Canada did reasonably well compared to other countries in this regard. Kwame McKenzie from the Wellesley Institute has incredibly powerful data that will be shared in another session next week on how bringing an intersectional lens and thinking carefully about the Black community and why there were higher infection rates, why there was more distrust of institutions because of the history of slavery and anti-Black racism, was fundamental in reducing the gap between infection and mortality rates in the Black community and the rest of the country. And when we look at economic opportunities, we saw the same thing with the impact of COVID on Black-owned businesses versus others. And the Black Business Professional Association did a study that compared the experience of Black business owners with members of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, showed Black business owners were twice as hard hit by COVID, much more likely to be closing their business as a result of COVID, half as likely to have access to government support, and 98% could not take on additional debt. And we have lots and lots of research of the experiences of the Black community with financial institutions, whether it's access to student loans, mortgages, or financing small, medium businesses. And the last example, which I think is, something people talk a lot about, is the design of technology products and services. There are sensors in bathrooms that don't recognize Black skin because they were designed wrong. There are AI applications that embed anti-Black racism. And we know this applies to gender as well. Women are more likely to die in car crashes and be severely injured because the research was done with crash test dummies based on men's male anatomy. And I don't want to get on too big a soapbox, but the notion that we have to fight most of all is this notion that somehow excellence and EDI are dichotomized. I would argue that whether you're looking at research, you're looking at talent and attracting and retaining the best and the brightest, you're looking at driving innovation, or you're looking at serving markets, diversity is a reality. And if you don't take that into account, you are going to miss opportunities. And this is something, when you asked about the business case, Jodi-Ann, this is something that has not changed. Markets are more diverse, and Marketing 101 is you take that into account when you're designing products and services. And if that's not enough, back to some of the points that Tamara was making about legislative frameworks, certainly in our country, you're putting your organization at risk because Canada, at least, still has embedded in its legislative frameworks, in its Charter of Rights and Freedoms, in its human rights legislation, in its jurisprudence, deep-rooted commitments to equity, diversity, and inclusion that you ignore at your peril. That being said, we are definitely seeing backlash here that is partly a spillover of what is in the US, and frankly, a right-wing white supremacist movement that is global. I think it's most obvious in the US, but we're seeing awful things happen in other parts of the world as well. And one of the things that I think will protect us is this commitment that is built into our Constitution, our legal frameworks, with a continued emphasis on, quote, the business case. And we can talk more about how that plays out. I would only say that it's been tough. COVID took a lot out of a lot of people. And when people are marginalized and when people suffer, they look for people to blame. And so there is some of that I think has created the backlash, where people seem to think that human rights is like a pie, and if someone gets more, you're going to get less. There's also been deliberate misinformation, and Canada's foreign interference investigations have shown very deliberate efforts to sow anti-immigrant sentiments coming from other countries as a way of promoting discord. And of course, in Canada, 60% of the Black community are also immigrants. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Cukier. You brought up a couple points, which will lead to my next question regarding the design of various items, seatbelt, for example, some technology that are generic based and not necessarily built with diversity in mind. And so, folks are saying that organizations weren't ready for the important shift that DEI requires, such as the transformation of, the workplace that requires some uncomfortable work, like re-engineering some systems and so on. What are your thoughts on that? Starting with Tamara, if you don't mind.
I just want to come back to what Dr. McEwen said with respect to academic freedom. In Quebec, we have also a law with respect to academic freedom, like it has been implemented 2 years ago. And I think that it was a way also to government to enter like in the academic sphere. So I don't think it's a question, and it goes back to what Wendy is saying, is that it's not a question that it's local, it's a question that it's more general. And when Wendy was talking about the way like the use of the media and the interference of foreign government, I think that the notion of fake news also, it's crucial to understand what's going on. And I had the opportunity to be on a panel with one of our colleagues who was talking about how the Russian are like entering into system to try to disrupt our like fundamental values. And Wendy stated like clearly that in Canada, we have a framework of, which implement some of the human rights legislation. And I think that our Article 15, and I will take a few seconds to read it, is very important to understand what is grounding us in that work of human rights. And for me, diversity is important in the sense that it permits human right to give a life in human right in diverse contexts, because sometimes it can be abstract, and we'll speak about that. So if we look at the definition of Article 15 and equality right, and Article 15, the goal is substantive equality, which I define later on, but substantive equality, equity in the framework of diversity. So let's say that Article 15 of our charter, the Article 15 became in force in 1985. So the article is read like that: every individual is equal before and under the law, has the right to equal protection and equal benefit of the law without discrimination, and in particular, without discrimination based on race, national, or ethnic origin, color, religion, sex, age, mental, or physical disability. And we have Article 15.2, which give us the possibility, give the government the possibility to make programs. So, and the program cannot be attacked as discriminatory, because those programs are supposed to take into account that there was discrimination in the system. So Article 15.2 permit those programs, and we can extend that to say that diversity and inclusion is also a way to alleviate those discrimination, historical discrimination that some groups suffer. So paragraph 2 says, subsection 2, sorry, subsection 1 does not preclude any law, program, or activity that has in object the amelioration of condition of disadvantaged individual or group, including those that are disadvantaged because of race, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, sex, age, mental or physical disability. So the government, when they thought about the charter, they thought about the fact that, there have to be some program or policy that will take into account that discrimination is part of the system. And when we talk about substantive equality, we mean that everyone should have equal rights, regardless their background, as we say, and some initiative has to take into account the specificity to arrive to equality. So if we look at the, you can see often somebody is running, okay, on a trail. So if you have depending where you're if you're a white man, you start a little bit further in advance. And if you're a Black woman, but with intersectionality, you have more discrimination. So you start the race behind, and you have some hurdle in that race to be able to achieve it. So this, I don't have the graphic, but it gives you an idea, and it's the same for people with handicap. Will have some, and it become not cumulative because their experience are specific, because intersectionality is not talking about the cumulative effect, but the particular situation in society. For example, a Black woman will face discrimination based not only on the fact that she's a woman, but also on the fact that she's Black, and she will face misogyny noire, which is part of the new language that we use to try to understand what's the reality of a Black woman. But a Black woman with handicap, with a disability, will live something different. So system have to take into account, and those differences are also social construct. So we have to deconstruct what we socially define as what is a normal person, and we have to deconstruct and to open society so people can have access to the benefit of being part of that society. So, I think that Rhonda as a nice example of, we're talking about diversity. People are not getting into it, but when we discussed it before, she talked about the train station. So I'm going to leave her with that train station and maybe come back. Rhonda.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Rhonda.
Thank you.
Yes. Over to you, Dr. Rhonda.
Thank you so much. And Tamara teased it up beautifully. Your question is really fundamental. There's always this sort of a giveaway that, people aren't ready to do DEI work. And it's a really interesting refrain, because my friend, Dr. Jackie Ottman, who is president at First Nations University here in Canada, she's fantastic in that she always says, from the Indigenous perspective, diversity is a fact of nature. It is actually just a fact. Nature is diverse, and this is, to fight for diversity seems very strange to people who have this perspective, because you're fighting against something that exists in nature. So I like to start with that. So to be ready to deal with something that exists seems an odd kind of paradox to me, and I really appreciate her saying that. She always says inclusion, though, is the choice. And that is where it comes in. You can choose to include or exclude. And that is pretty much what the Article 15 is talking about, right? That really in Canada, you cannot choose to be discriminatory. That's not allowed, although people go ahead anyway.
Right.
On the issue of readiness as well, this is the analogy that Tamara is talking about. If we say that we are headed to a particular destination and we're going to take a train, and we all we're going to this destination, we say, well, the train is on the platform, it's about to go. Everybody's agreeing. But what we have to remember is that this is also an individual readiness. The readiness of each person in their personal, inside their being. Are you ready? Are you ready to even go to the station to this destination? Are you on the platform and you'd like to get on, but you somehow feel you're uninformed or your life experiences make it such that it's hard for you to get on this train? There's some people at the front of the train. There's some people who have forgotten about the train and took a plane or walked because they need to go and they are ready beyond the rest. So there's a certain amount of individual readiness that I think is really a big issue here. And we make the assumption that people should get on this train. It's obvious, it's natural. But we have to remember that there are many things that people are, work that people need to do for themselves, no matter how many forums or discussions or panels we hold, no matter how much EDI money you spend on training.
Oh, yeah.
There will be those who are just not able to come to the station or board the train. And this is where we can get into conflict with things like the charter and the Article 15. How do we handle this level of resistance? There's guilt as well. There are positions of fragility where people feel like they can't deal with this. They'll say that I didn't do anything. I didn't do anything to George Floyd. You know, so I'm good, right? But they don't want to deal with it in their daily lives, and they will engage in many things that they don't see as discriminatory because they haven't done the work. So I think there's a piece here that's about that. And, you know, the George Floyd, that moment in time that his life was lost. He was murdered on the basis, and everyone, it was the pandemic time, so we all watched in horror at what was clearly act of hate and violence and discrimination. Yet, as time passes, there is a backlash. I've even heard some people say it's a part of an Obama backlash in the United States, where you deal with it and then you let it wash over you and you move on with your life. And I think that's what we're fighting. It's not, and this for me is where we need to lean into those programs that the Article 15 rightfully says need to be created to combat and to address discriminatory practices. But if we can't reach people individually, we're going to have a very hard time moving forward.
Yes, thank you so much for that, Dr. Rhonda. I will follow up shortly with just asking for a bit of a summary there. But I'll hear from Dr. Cukier, and then I'll come back to that. Thank you so much for that. Dr. Cukier, your response?
Appreciate the comments that were made. And I think that one of the, if the people working on equity, diversity, and inclusion made any errors in recent years, I would say it was the idea that everybody thought the same way as they did, and not recognizing that sometimes silence is not agreement. And, you know, it's interesting because backlash isn't new. You know, when we think about the movement of progress, whether it's the suffragette movement or the civil rights movement or the more recent feminist movement in the 90s, it was sort of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And Susan Faludi published a book in 1991 called Backlash, which was really tracking exactly what we're seeing today, only at that time it was focused primarily on women. So one of the things that I think, and there's a PhD thesis, I forget the student's name, where she quoted an Indigenous elder who said, I learned early on when I was hunting that I had to think like a bear. And my argument is, when we're trying to do this work, we have to start thinking like a bear, which means we have to try to get inside the heads of people who don't agree with us and figure out what sorts of things will be meaningful to them. And, you know, because I'm in a business school, I fall back on arguments around prosperity and economic development and innovation and talent, and those very, you know, to me, irrefutable arguments that this is good for everybody. It isn't about taking away from you to give something to somebody else. It's about leveling the playing field so we can all rise together. So I think that perspective is really important. And in 1991, after the Montreal Massacre, which was a misogynistic mass shooting in Canada, I was tasked with providing equity training, primarily focused on gender, to all the first-year engineers at the university. And the only reason they gave it to me was because I had worked on gun control. So I had gone into rooms with angry men with guns and not back down. No one at the university wanted to do this. They were scared. And in fact, they had to send in security a few times. But what I went into the room, and what I saw were a lot of racialized men and very few women. And so what I tried to do was draw the connections between different kinds of privilege and different kinds of obstacles, which unite people as opposed to the things that drive us apart. Also used a lot of Star Trek to illustrate my points. But I think that one of the things I have found effective is we think about privilege just as skin color, and there's no question that white privilege is a thing. But there are other kinds of privilege as well. You know, growing up rich with parents who went to university, who both speak English in Canada or French, gives you a leg up over someone who grew up poor, the child of immigrants, who, you know, worked around the clock and didn't know what an engineer even was, let alone how to get their kid into engineering school. And so trying to find those points of connection, going back to what Dr. McEwen said, I think is one of the ways we can get people on the train. Because frankly, the challenge here is not preaching to the converted, to the people who think like us. And, you know, there are some examples where, you know, people have rehabilitated Ku Klux Klan members, but those are kind of few and far between. What's in the big middle is the mush sector. Of people who don't really know what they think, may not feel very strongly one way or the other. And if we can figure out how to get into their hearts and minds with arguments that make sense to them, I believe that that makes a difference. And certainly that's true in the work that I've done in the corporate sector and with employers and so on. So, you know, think like a bear.
Yes, thank you so much.
Yes, I
And thank
agree.
you for your courage for stepping into those challenging spaces. So thank you so much for that. You all partially touched on my next question. And so what I'm going to ask is just for a bit of a summary, like a 1-minute summary of this point. Some say the diversity, equity, inclusion framework is unsuccessful because the systems that are in place don't fully support the initiatives. What are your thoughts on this? Just provide some quick points on that.
Just before we start that, I'm sorry that I'm going to interrupt, but I think that what Wendy was saying and also Dr. McEwen are saying, it's also linked with history because we don't know our history. So people don't know history, so they think that everybody's equal because they don't know.
Yes.
And I think it's fundamental that we go back to history. History has to be taught very early, so we understand what is the reality of the other, the one that, and I think that I negotiated the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for Canada, and that also was the goal, is to understand what's up, what was the reality of the indigenous people that we see that are like either drunk on the street, but not understanding that they were like victim of sexual abuse and the ripple effect of intergenerational sexual abuse. So I think that we have to go back to history, because one of the things that Rhonda said is that I'm not responsible for George Floyd. And that argument, when we were negotiating, that was an argument that was put on the table, that Canadians that are currently alive are not responsible. Maybe they are not responsible, but they have the benefit that goes from that, the history. So I think, and that's where, like, we know, that's where like privilege and benefit goes together. And indeed, there's like the question of differential resource, like as when we talk about privilege, but also privilege is also intersectional. And there's the question, and the black skin, and it's so interesting because I was with another doctor lately, and we were talking about racialized women and the fact that we're like in the situation that we're currently. And there's also some tension in groups with respect to speak about some Black women have some advantage that other doesn't have, indeed. But we have to, the reality is that when you show up as a person of color, or a racialized person, or a Black person, there's the unconscious, what's the name of the philosopher? It's part of the unconscious of everybody, the way that we frame us. We are like, just the fact that we enter in a room, we are framed. And we have to deconstruct that frame. So they're going to say, oh, Rhonda is great, finally.
Yes.
Yeah, they would say, Rhonda speaks such good English.
That's such good English.
Yeah.
Yes,
have a beautiful smile. She's not angry. So those things are like, those things are like, when we enter a room, those things are the thing that we have to deconstruct just to start talking in the way that we have and we're doing at the notion of double and multiple consciousness. We have to be conscious all the time of the way the other is seeing us. So those are the things that is fundamental, and that DEI, people have to understand that, when we enter into a room, our history is preceding us, and not our history, but the history that are made about us.
Correct.
And we have to deconstruct that. And I think that history is key. And building and on those both doctors that I listen, I think that, to people to get into the train have to understand where people are coming from.
Correct.
It's
And Tamara is in a way pulling the second question into the one you've just asked, Dr. Francis, because if the DEI frameworks are unsuccessful when we have not embedded them with context and history. It's really quite fundamental. And these are the humanities that we are getting rid of in the academy, right? And these are the places, right?
Yes, and that is how unconscious biases thrive. That is how stereotypes continue to thrive. It's that ignorance and that lack of knowledge of the history, people's relationships with each other, the land, and so on. That's when that's missing, we can see those gaps coming through. When we see people, commending you on your ability to speak well and so on, right? So absolutely, definitely agree. Dr. Cukier,
I wanted to add just one thing to
Dr.
what Tamara was saying, and that is, success, the success or lack thereof of DEI frameworks also can be tied to this idea of what about me, right? So I call this kind of the reverse lens kicks in very quickly. And so you're doing a tremendous amount of work and you're gaining ground in one area, and another group starts saying, but what about me? And so I have a colleague too at the university who's made a really beautiful metaphor, and he said, when a house in your neighborhood is on fire, right, you focus on the fire. This is not to say that the house that is not on fire in the neighborhood is not valuable and not useful and not fantastic, and not we don't care about that house. It's just that you deal with the one on fire first. And that is that. And there's this idea that if you focus on one group, then you are by definition deciding that the other group is not important. And I say this with some care, but I have been reading very carefully my colleagues. There are some of my Jewish colleagues who have been writing about how anti-Semitism, which is a real and true thing, anti-Semitism has been just pervasive and under the surface because the color of the skin doesn't always give away what is happening on the basis of religion or cultural practice. Yet anti-Semitism has been weaponized in the current moment as what about this group? And now let's take down DEI on behalf of another group. And now
Yes.
these colleagues are looking at what was done in their name and saying, this is not what was done in their name and saying, this is not what we were talking about. So now no one is going to benefit
Yes.
because one group spoke out, and it was actually a horrific outcome of what should have been a group seeking remediation from discrimination, and the answer ended up. And when I call the three names of the three presidents in the U.S. who resigned, you will note that Dr. Cukier also spoke about intersectionality. They were all women.
Yes.
Right? Women we do not hold presidential university positions. It's very, much in the minority. And yet this movement, which was actually fronted by other women,
Yes.
to take down women in positions of leadership. And so we have to just always be careful. Sometimes the DEI frameworks, they bring these unintended consequences of drawing attention, and then people using it against the entire framework. And so we lose not just one step forward, two steps back, but we lose the actual ground we're stepping on.
For sure. Dr. Cukier spoke about the pie and having that one piece removed, and it creates a situation where people feel as if the pie is being eliminated. But Dr. Cukier, your points on that. Thank you so much, Dr. Rhonda, for that.
I would just build on what was said.
Oops, your microphone, Dr. Cukier.
Can you hear me now?
No.
Can you hear me?
You're sounding a bit muffled.
Can you hear me now?
There you go. Fantastic.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry for the big face in the frame. I had to get closer
No
to my
worries.
microphone. So I just want to underscore exactly what was said by both Dr. McEwen and Tamara, and that is you do have to start with knowledge. And as a U of T history major in my former life, I am a product of the Canadian education system, and I grew up thinking we were safe haven for slaves. We were the Underground Railroad. We were the saviors. I did not know about the history of slavery in Canada. I did not know about the history of segregation in Canada. I did not know about the Chinese Exclusion Act. I did not know about residential schools. I did not know any of that stuff. And I have a PhD, right? So if I didn't know that stuff, it's pretty clear that lots of, and I'm the head of the Diversity Institute. It's pretty clear that those knowledge gaps are really significant. The other piece I'll just come back to is evidence. We did something called the Black Experience Project about 10 years ago now. It was a long interviews with 1,500 people who identified as Black in the Greater Toronto area, where we have the biggest Black community in Canada. And many Canadians always compare ourselves to the US, and we're so much better. That was such an eye-opener for me. 50% of the respondents did not think Canada was any better than the US when it came to the experiences of racism. We've done recent research that shows 50% of Black people working in Canada experience discrimination based on race, and women as well on gender. And it's worst in the nonprofit sector and government than it is in the corporate sector. Like, these are facts. These are irrefutable facts. The Canadian Human Rights Commission was found to have embedded anti-Black racism in its practices. So we have to start by naming the problem, and we have to recognize that there are no simple solutions to complex problems. So, celebrating Black History Month and making a poster and singing songs and having, cultural days and unconscious bias training, all those things can help build a culture of inclusion, but it's not enough. You have to dig into your strategies, your structures, your policies, your programs from end to end. And it's not just about human resources. It's about, where do you source your products? How do you design your products? How do you market your products? Who do you partner with? What are the pathways you're creating for Black youth into your organization. So there's a lot of work. And what I would say, you know, and I'll take this on, part of the failure of a lot of people working on equity, diversity, and inclusion is they went after the low-hanging fruit. They counted the number of workshops and training sessions and posters that they had without really digging into those systemic issues. Because just as we see anti-Black racism embedded in our institutions, anti-Black racism is embedded in our organizations. This includes universities, hospitals, anywhere I've worked.
Wow. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Cukier, and bringing in the point of the point of education, where that was lacking throughout your educational experience, is also quite important. Embedding this information in the educational system is essential for continuing the work within workspaces, organizations, et cetera, et cetera. So that was quite interesting to hear. We have about 3 questions left, with half an hour to go. So I'm going to ask if we are able to, provide some quick points on each of the responses going forward, so that we can touch on all of the questions. They're all quite interesting. So up next are
Jodi, can I also draw your attention to the fact that people have questions in the Q&A box as well?
Absolutely.
Would be nice to get to.
Okay, absolutely. So I will touch on this question, and then while we have the responses going, I will get into the Q&As. So at this point, I just wanted to ask, what are the arguments currently that support diversity, equity, and inclusion, and are these linked with human rights? And we can start with Tamara.
I think that human right is like the base for like diversity and diversity, equity and inclusion, in a sense that, it's human rights, are like there's a lot of like international instrument that define what are human rights. Article 15 embedded in our like in the Canadian experience, but it's human right. There's a problem with diversity and inclusion, and Wendy pointed out a bit about the problem that it was maybe seen, it was like diversity and inclusion was a way like not to talk about human rights. It was less loaded. People prefer like it was more soft. But the reality of it, like when you have like the program that were well built, not built only on like, and Wendy could speak more about that, the fact that training, there's an article about the fact that training on diversity and inclusion is not working, and because they didn't have the impact that they were supposed to have. But when you ground it in like human rights discourse, in the sense that we're talking about non-discrimination, we're talking about participation, we're talking about inclusion, we're talking about substantive equality, those are elements that are crucial to human rights. So when a program of diversity and inclusion is built in taking into account those elements, it's a way to make like diversity, to make human rights applicable to people who don't understand really what is equality and stuff. So I would say that it's a way diversity and inclusion well construct will be able to support the human rights agenda and bring us forward. But the crucial word is well construct. And on that, I guess that Wendy could speak about that a bit, about the idea of well construct. Because there's some initiative that was just window dressing and people didn't have the experience, and the impact that they have is negative, and we are like, it's part of the backlash. But when it's well constructed with every element, as Wendy pointed out, it will help us to arrive at human rights. And there's also organization have also some human rights obligation under the ESG, and there's also, and I will find the name, I lost it in my mind, but there's also the obligation under the United Nations Guiding Principle of Business and Human Rights. So those are the elements that are like, obligation, and diversity is inclusion is a tool to achieve those obligations. I will finish there and give it, passer le bâton.
Yeah, I can take up there. I am in, a clear agreement with Tamara on that. I do though always think about how it falls on the ground, right? Like, so these are, we need to have the strength of the charter and the strength of the Article 15 in Canada is tremendous place to start. And Tamara's right. If you design your program appropriately, it certainly holds up much better. But what I noticed, I'll give you a specific example of what I've seen on the ground. So there comes the counter argument. I was part of a discussion on doing group hires for Black faculty at an institution. And this is instead of hiring one person here and goes into a department when there are 35 people who are not looking or sounding or have the same experience, who probably were trained as Dr. Cukier were, who don't understand that person's battles with peer review, who don't understand that when you do research that is connected to Black bodies and Black minds, that it's often not picked up in the big journals because the reviewers don't know how to read it, etc. People who do community-based research, they're like, is that real research? That's not empirical. These are the arguments. So one argument that some universities have done is say, let's hire a cluster, like a group of faculty together who are all Black. So we'll hire 5 Black people to come into this space that's very important to us. The arguments against that are fantastic. They're like, well, that goes against the charter, right? It's actually fascinating how they interpret. The interpretation of that then becomes an argument that we have to defend when they're like, well, how is it that you can put into the job ad that you are specifically looking for this group of people? And that is not seen as, anti everything else, and people drag their feet. It is astonishing that in places of higher education where we know we are clear about this, the evidence is there, everything is laid out, and yet severe resistance in the academy on doing something like, let's hire 3. Oh, that's an invasion. So I think honestly, on the ground, implementing it depends on the willingness of people to interpret accurately and in the spirit of what is intended, how to execute on it. One other thing I wanted to do, there is a fantastic question in the Q&A that I wanted to address since it's kind of related. And someone in the Q&A asks, they say, I'm Francophone, I'm in Quebec, and why are the Francophone universities complying to EDI, but not signing the Scarborough Charter? Yeah. And for those of you who don't know the Scarborough Charter, perhaps someone from Diversity Institute can pop a link into the Scarborough Charter into the chat. But the Scarborough Charter was developed out of the very hard work of the University of Toronto Scarborough campus under Dr. Wisdom Teti, his leadership. And it made a call out for colleges and universities to not just say they're doing DEI, but to actually meet certain criteria. And that included things like putting a specific individual on the campus is responsible for making sure that these things are happening and looking at issues of transparency and accountability and redress of problems and so forth. So yes, I know my Quebec colleagues are very interested in EDI. In fact, they depend on African Francophone students for their internationals, right? They really know that without those bodies, they struggle to meet their needs, and yet they don't sign the Scarborough Charter. So a few reasons are given. The first is that the charter was developed in English, and it takes time to have it translated and to see how it applies within the Quebec province and the culture there. The second reason is that it's a straight call for resources. So you can't just say I have committed to EDI. To sign the charter, you have to meet certain criteria. So you have to hire someone or give someone the responsibility for that in the organization. That's a budget line. You have to implement a certain number of things by a certain time. Those are resources that have to be funded and so forth. So I know that there are some places that cannot sign until they meet the minimum. And I think that is probably what is to some extent happening in Quebec. I know though that the work is still happening, just not under the banner of the Scarborough Charter. And I do hope to see more join and sign on to the Scarborough Charter.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. That was going to be the first question that I would have addressed there. So thank you so much for that. Before moving on to the next question in the Q&A, Dr. Cukier, do you have any points to add before moving on to that next question regarding the arguments to support DEI?
In terms of the arguments, again, because I'm in a business,
we're going to need that face closer again, Dr. Cukier.
Sorry. In terms of, I'm in a business school, so my starting point is always, can you hear me?
It's still giving us a bit of a muffle.
Okay.
There you go.
I don't know what it is. My starting point is always what's important to the organization, what's important to the person. And the best equity, diversity, and inclusion strategy is one that is baked in to the existing organizational strategy. So if you're a university, you have a strategy that addresses research, you have a strategy that addresses curriculum, pedagogy, student services. Each one of those pillars should have EDI baked into it. If you're Starbucks, you have a strategy that looks at, product development, customer service, customer experience, talent, whatever those things are. You need to start with those pillars and bake the EDI lens and the anti-Black racism lens right into those core commitments. And, I got kicked off lots of committees because I was a little too aggressive about looking for metrics, transparency, and accountability. And there's a lot of talk in this space, but without metrics, transparency, and accountability, it means nothing.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. I will give a couple points on my position as an immigration consultant and seeing the value that international students bring to post-secondary institutions, but that only becoming highlighted after, some challenges have arisen with, changes in policy and so on, also EDI related. So that can be discussed at a later time. But in the chat, we have one question about the change from EDI or DEI at the University of Alberta to access, community, and belonging. The question was, can you say more about the potential negative influences of, consequences, not influences, consequences of moving from DEI to access, community, and belonging? What could be the possible consequences of that?
I'll start, but Tamara can definitely pick up on that. I do know, I have spoken to my colleagues in the University of Alberta on this topic. I know that they have done a lot of work on and have strong commitment to these programs, but they report that they polled their own internal community to ask about it, and what they discovered was that the term DEI has become so politicized, and it is now so seen as so divisive that it was making they felt it was becoming a hindrance to them able to execute their programs. It was becoming a problem. So instead of doing away with the programs. What they chose to do instead was to shift the narrative by changing the words. And you could look at it in two ways. In one way, they are finding a way to pivot in response to their own local community and their own environment in the province, which for those who are not in Canada is much more conservative. So they have had to find a way to get through it, versus continuing to fight for those words. But I think it does harm in some ways too, because then it makes it feel like we have to keep shifting. We have to change the words and make it words that people feel more comfortable with, that people find more acceptable, that have, to avoid the political problems associated. And so it's always back to the people who are trying to make the change, to continue to pivot, to make it more comfortable, make it easier for people. And so I know what they're saying on the one hand. On the other hand, I can see how this hurts a movement, right?
For sure. Absolutely. Tamara?
It's a question of human right. At the end of the day, I guess that, the language has to be also the language of human right. We tried the DEI, we thought that it was being more like applicable to a certain extent. It was until the backlash. So I think that in the beginning of our discussion, we talk about the charter. And after that, Wendy will talk like a bear, and that's the dance that we have to do. But the thing is that if we go like participation, inclusion, and Canada is an immigration society. When you look at the data, and I will refer to Wendy about those data, but the reality of it, and she and her institute have made like a new report about Black, and the fact that they are some of them are highly educated and still in the minimum in lower end jobs. The reality of it, and we go back at the beginning of the conversation, we have to name the problem to be able to answer it. And that was Jodi-Ann who said it in a report in 2007, I think, when he came in Canada. He said that we have nice infrastructure and we have nice law, but the thing, and we don't have any intellectual strategy to deal with racism. And we have to deal with racism. And he said, Jodi-Ann in the report said, name the problem. For example, if I have the cold and I take a medication for menopause, it won't work. Okay, so let's name the problem. For me, both work, but anyway. Let's name the problem. So the problem is that, and to name the problem, we have to go back to history because, and I'm going back to what Wendy said, she has a PhD, didn't know about, the only story that she knew about race was the underworld road, come on, and it's funny because my education about racism, I made it myself. Because there was no way to find it, I made it myself. I start and I look and I said, wow. And nobody told me that because they told me another story. And it's important. And I think it's crucial to go back to who are we and what we want to be and what are our fundamental values. And this moment, Trump is putting on our trench to say, as nation, as countries, who are we? And are we courageous enough to say who we are and for what we're going to fight for? Correct. And for me, that's it. And we have 15. Now we have to give it leg. And we know that, there's modification to the Employment Equity Act is also another tool in Canada to try to involve the inclusiveness. But we have, and there's a report that we could put on the chat. So there's a lot of report that we have to put on the chat. By the way, Wendy, you referred to a lot of them, but there's another report, and we have to say, who are we? It's not a question of window dressing. We have to walk the talk.
Absolutely.
And that's it. And
I
don't
think
you
it doesn't
think-
matter what letters we use, as long as it's grounded in the principles of human rights.
Yeah,
You know, so because I know this bothers people. It bothers. I can understand why it bothers people, but as you said, what Tamara is reminding us, we have to stay grounded in the philosophy of the human rights, and this will be the most successful.
Absolutely.
because it's something that everybody is, some people in some big room in the United States, in Geneva, they agree on that. And that's the fundamental thing that's supposed to make a social cohesion between countries. Now we have to walk the talk. And that means that anybody can be in position of power if they have the qualification. And the qualification, and we don't have the time for the discussion of merit because that thing has to be unpacked. Really,
Yes.
we don't have the time. That's for next year. But it's a rendezvous.
Anybody see the presidential debate?
But there is
want to ask a question about
on merit. But I think we should ask merit. Merit came up in the chat as well. I think we could go straight to merit.
Yes, for
And
sure.
maybe where Wendy can kick off, maybe Dr. Cukier.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, my daughter talks a lot about mediocre white men, and we have so many examples with respect. The people who talk about the meritocracy as being opposed to EDI, I say the same thing. You don't have a meritocracy if you don't take into account EDI. I mean, in Toronto, half the population was born outside of the country. Another quarter of the population, like me, are the children of people who have born outside the country. Like half the population's women. Like, who do you think you're talking to if you ignore equity, diversity, and inclusion? It's lazy. It's laziness to fall back on whatever that new acronym is that they're talking about. There is no meritocracy without attention to equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I know this because my colleague Seth Dvorkin, who's a computer scientist, gave me an algorithm. And the algorithm is this: accomplishment equals talent plus opportunity plus resources. Okay, get that. Your accomplishments are a function of talent plus opportunity plus resources. So if you want to understand talent, you have to look at accomplishment and subtract opportunity or privilege and resources. It's as simple as that. You can't identify talent if you don't take into the account that, as Tamara said, some people have a head start. Some people don't have obstacles in their path. Some people never have to overcome barriers or struggle. It's handed to them on a silver platter. So, anyways, I can go on, but that for me is really foundational.
Thank you so much. A very good, enriching discussion. We have about 8 minutes left, and I wanted to just ask for summative statements from each of you, from each of your perspectives with regards to where we are with DEI within the human rights framework. So from the legal perspective, from the academic perspective, and from the business case perspective, may I just ask for a summative statement based on all the questions that we had today, where we are currently, and what can we look forward to with respect to DEI and where that's headed. We can start with Tamara.
Again?
It's always you, Tamara. Thanks.
Tamara, the icebreaker. So, but for the, we have like the tools, now we have to put them into action. And DEI is something that, there could be some critic, and we went through that. but I think that, it's a place that we can still use if there's a place for a refresher, strengthening, and, make sure that, all the elements are there, and I'm going to refer to Wendy, to look at ADI at every step of the work and everywhere, it has to be embedded. It has to be embedded. And we have to be courageous, and we need allies, because we know that the ride won't be easy, because now, it won't be an easy ride. It's an attack. And, when I said at the beginning that DEI work, it worked to a certain extent, because it bring people that were not supposed to be in power, it bring them into power. And that's the backlash. And we have to be very supportive of people who are going to suffer that backlash too, because Rhonda spoke about president of university who have suffered that backlash. She spoke also about intersectionality. Those women were a woman in intersectional position. I guess that we have to be very aware, and courage would be the title of the next 4 or 5 years. You have to be courageous and fund organization. UN has to be fun. People, people who wants to make a challenge at court, they should be funded also, to make sure that we be able to achieve what we want to achieve as a society, as nation, as in worldwide. And there's other questions that are on the table, but and I think that what Rhonda said about diversity and the Aboriginal person, elder who came with that notion of diversity, is very important. We want diversity is a fact. We want inclusion as a right. Because all those resources, they are resource of the world. Some people are taking them under their, les approprier, taking them, but those resources are supposed to be shared. I'm sorry.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. Dr. Rhonda, your thoughts?
So just to conclude and wrap, I think Tamara's courage is the word that she's leading us to follow in the future steps. Mine would probably be accountability, because that individual courage needs to be well recognized and rewarded. But when people are not choosing that, they need to be held to account. And one thing we do really well in Canada is just let it go. We won't don't cause any problems. Put your head down, do your work. One day you will be rewarded, the higher powers will save us. I actually think the systems need to make people accountable. What is the accountability for not following through on Article 15? There are mechanisms that we can take, and we just choose not to do so. And when we see people behaving poorly and in contravenance of many of these things, what do we do about it? So to be accountable and to hold institutions to account for not following through on remediation, I think that is really important. So for me, I would love to see the universities, for example, the boards of these people who resigned, they should account, because they didn't go out on their own and say what they said to the House, to the commissions.
Absolutely.
They were advised, right? So I think there's accountability that's missing.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. That accountability factor is also important for carrying out this work. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Rhonda. Dr. Cukier, from the business perspective.
I want to give a personal perspective, not a business perspective, because I think in addition to courage and accountability, we have to, in the current environment, recognize the fact that is the banality of evil, right? And it comes to Tamara's point a bit about allyship. Someone asked why anti-Black racism versus DEI generally. Lots of research that shows the experience of Black people in Canada and in around the world is fundamentally different than other racialized groups. It isn't to say that other racialized groups are not discriminated against, but anti-Black racism is a thing. It is a thing. That being said, you know, there are a lot of lessons people have taken from the Holocaust. The one that I take is the words of Reverend Neil Morler. Many of you probably have heard this. First, they came for the trade unionists. I did nothing because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the trade unionists. Then they came for the something else. I did nothing because I wasn't one of those. Then they came for the Jews. I did nothing because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left. And if you think about the speech that the priest gave at the inauguration, where she called for mercy for trans people and for immigrants, I would simply say the people who are who discriminate against Black people, immigrants, Muslims, Jews, women, it's the same enemy to a very large extent. People shouldn't be fighting with each other about whose rights are more important than someone else's. We have to stand up for each other because, quite honestly, there are more of us than there are of them. But the problem is, we know from history, as Dr. McEwen said, if you're comfortable, don't make waves. We got to make waves, and we got to recognize there's a common enemy, and we have to stand up.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you all so much. We made it just on the cusp of time. We do have some more questions in the chat that we weren't able to get to right away. But I do want to take this time to thank all the attendees for being here today. This is a timely discussion with all the challenges that we're facing, both you know, on the domestic and the international fronts as well. So thank you to our panelists as well for your time today being here. The recording will be made available. So questions about the availability of the questions that were asked and the answers to said questions will be made available online as well. We thank you so much for being here with us today, and we look forward to our future conversations around this topic. Thank you all.